Hello, everyone. This it will be my final recap of the 31 days of Halloween horror movie watch that I was doing. This is coming up a few days after Halloween. It is now November 5th, so I got caught up in a bunch of other things. It was my local comic book convention weekend, so I spent a Friday and Saturday there. Well, I went Friday and Sunday there. Saturday, I went to the Criterion sale because it is now that time of year once again. It is the November leg of the Criterion sale, so I was just completely preoccupied by other things, but I wanted to finish this out since, of course, I did start it. So, without further ado, let me go back to November to October 22nd, where I watched the movie The Evil of Frankenstein. And The Evil of Frankenstein is part of the Hammer horror franchise of Frankenstein movies that starred predominantly Peter Cushing. I believe he was in all of them, I believe except for one. And The Evil of Frankenstein is a very interesting movie. It's a very another different film than the usual Frankenstein films that you're probably used to with the Universal Monster version. Um, Basically, this film picks up with Dr. Frankenstein back to his hometown of Karlstad, and he is back to his old ways of reconstructing another monster. And of course, when he reconstructs another monster, he decides to get this hypnotist in order to control it. And this hypnotist decides to go on a power trip and control the monster to fulfill all kinds of vendettas that he has. And of course, that leads to all kind of bad things happening. It is an interesting movie in the French in the evil it is an interesting movie in the Hammer horror franchise. It's not the best of the Frankenstein films. It's not the best Hammer horror film. It is just okay. I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. It's really worth watching if you're a bit of a completist, and of course, if you're a Peter Cushing fan. Next up, which would be the 23rd of October, and that would be the movie A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge, or sometimes it's referred to A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2. This film is predominantly different than the original. That was what was really surprising to me about it. It came out in 1985, and it's not directed by Wes Craven. I don't believe he was involved in it much at all. It is very different in the sense like as the original film unfolded, Freddy would attack you in your dreams, and this film is not so much like that. This film is dealing with a character who is having all of these kind of sexual things happening with him, and it's very sexual in its thematic overtones, very homoerotic in certain moments. It's also a film where Freddy is trying to get to the real world through this young kid. And of course, Freddy is reprised by Robert Englund, who pretty much played him throughout the franchise, except for, of course, the remake they did back in a couple of years ago. That was Jackie Earl Haley, but Robert Englund, of course, is great in the film. It's rather underrated in the franchise, I've come to learn, because it is so different. I consider it the Halloween 3 of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise because it is so wildly different. It's bold though. It's very interesting and ambitious how they decided to go in a completely different route than the original for the sequel. You don't see that a lot. Mostly sequels to big hit movies are kind of mostly the same, and it tends to be repetitive over time. But I found myself liking this film for what it is. The acting isn't great, the dialogue isn't great for most of it. The young actors aren't so good, so I gave the film a 3 out of 5 stars. Next up, of course, is the 24th of October, and I decided to continue with the Nightmare on Elm Street films to go with A Nightmare on Elm Street 3: Dream Warriors. Now, this film is fantastic in my opinion. It is just as good as the first film, maybe slightly better in the sense that the characters feel like they have more to do, and there's really a more interesting story that really picks up directly from the first film. We are once again have the main character from the first film who is portrayed by Heather Langenkamp. the character of Nancy, who was the victim of the first film, or who the first film really revolved around. And she is now older. She's now a bit of a psychiatrist or something like that at this mental hospital. And what she has found out is that all of these patients that are all these young kids or these teenagers all of having dreams of Freddy, and she can relate to that directly because it happened to her. And there's a lot of interesting backstory that goes behind why they're all having those dreams, and they kind of have to band together in order to defeat Freddy. And this film is really fantastic. Once again, Robert Englund is great in it. There's a young Patricia Arquette who's also in the movie. This had to be one of her first roles. She's so young in the movie. I thought she was really good. I really enjoyed this movie. I kind of wished these sequels would have picked up from this and revolved more around these characters. I understand that that's not the case, and I've only ever seen a couple of the Nightmare on Elm Street films. I've only seen the first, second, third, and I've seen New Nightmare. Those are the and I've seen Freddy versus Jason. But that's not really a Nightmare on Elm Street movie. That's more of a an interesting kind of mashup of both worlds. It's fun. It's not great, but it's fun. But those are the only films I've seen within this franchise, and I'm very curious to see how the others go because I hear it's the one thing with the horror franchise where the more films that tend to be in it, the weaker they get as time goes on. That happens with a lot of franchises as well. So for anyone interested, I gave this film a 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend perhaps skipping the second movie entirely if you're a big fan of the first one and just watching this one. So next up, we have the 25th of October, and this is when I watched the original Flatliners. Many of you may remember that Flatliners was remade about a year ago, I think, or 2 years ago. I'm not quite sure. I didn't see that version of Flatliners because I hadn't seen the original, and I really wasn't that interested in it. So I decided to watch the original, directed by Joel Schumacher. Came out in 1990, stars a cast that I'm pretty sure many of you are familiar with. Kiefer Sutherland, Julia Roberts, Kevin Bacon, William Baldwin, Oliver Platt are all in this movie. This was before really any of them had become um, big stars. Kevin Bacon and Kiefer Sutherland were very much younger, brighter stars at the time. Julia Roberts was just starting her career. I believe this was before she did Pretty Woman, or it's around the same time. Um, Let me just check up on that. Yeah, Pretty Woman came out the same year, so she was just about to explode on the scene, and this film is really interesting. If you're not familiar with Flatliners, basically these 5 medical students all decide that they're gonna try this experiment where they're going to, die and then be resuscitated, and they each of them decide that they're going to, die for longer, stay dead long before they're revived. And what this ends up doing is they start seeing a lot of nightmarish type thing. They start seeing a lot of illusions. They start having a lot of just really weird psychological moments that really affect them. And a lot of them have to do with something they regret within their past or something that has to deal with their past. I really liked the whole dream sequences in this film. I rather enjoyed it from that perspective. The film is a little bit dated when it comes to some of its elements, and the concept I think is more interesting than the actual execution. Probably why they decided to remake it, but there's really not much more you can do with modern technology. I think would really advance it significantly. But I found myself rather enjoying the movie, and I would recommend it to people who are interested in seeing a Joel Schumacher film before those Batman films that he did, but specifically before Batman and Robin, which was really bad and kind of sent his career on a downward spiral. So for anyone interested, I give this film kind of a 3.25 out of 5 stars. So now moving on to the next film, which would of course be on the 26th of October, and I watched Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from 1931. This is a film that starred Frederick March in the title role of both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It also starred Miriam Hopkins, who was another famous Golden Age Hollywood actress from that time. This film is one of the earliest adaptations of the Robert Louis Stevenson story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This This story has been adapted and readapted so many times in many different versions. This is considered one of the best versions, and I have to agree it is. For those of you not familiar with that classic story, basically, Dr. Henry Jekyll believes that there are two distinct properties within humans. There's an evil side, there's a good side, and he's trying to devise a way to separate the two. And he comes up with this formula and he ends up experimenting upon himself with it, and it ends up transforming him into this Mr. Hyde character who is, for lack of a better term, really evil. He's evil both in his physical appearance and his actions. And I was really surprised to see how brutal he was in this movie. Also, Frederick March's performance is absolutely fantastic because he has to play the two roles completely different than one another because of these characters have being so different. And of course, the makeup on him when he turns into Mr. Hyde is also fantastic. And you see the transformation sequences, like he'll be looking into a mirror and you see the him slowly fade into the Mr. Hyde character, and it's really fantastically well done, especially for the time, considering they didn't have the capabilities that we have now when it comes to special effects in movies. A lot of things had to be done practically within the camera and things like that. So I really, really like this film a lot. Frederick March did end up winning an Oscar for his performance in the movie. So I highly recommend seeing this movie if you can find it. I found it on Filmstruck. Unfortunately, Filmstruck is closing down as of November 29th of this year, which is really unfortunate. So please give this a watch if you can. I gave this film a 4 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd. Next up here is the 27th of October, and this was a film that is part of the Criterion Collection. It's a Criterion that I didn't own, but I was able to watch it on Filmstruck, and I've been kind of wanting to watch it for a few years, and that is Carnival of Souls from 1962. This film is a bit of a cult film. It's a really great precursor to a lot of the more art house avant-garde horror films that I think many people are aware of. Films specifically from someone like David Lynch and directors of his kind that are really psychological, really weird. You're not quite sure what's going on. It's more of a mood piece, more of a feeling than it is actually delving into real tangible plot. But this film is really, really good in my opinion. It's really unlike most films within the horror genre. Basically, what happens is at the beginning of this movie, a woman is involved in a car crash that goes off a bridge, and she survives that car crash. She comes up out of the water. People are searching for the car, and she just ends up coming out of the water herself. And she ends up moving to a new town, and there is this strange, mysterious place. Um, there's this strange, mysterious place that she is constantly alert to. It's this big, grand place that's a bit of an old relic of a time past, and she begins seeing also visions of this frightening individual man who she believes is stalking her. But is this man real? Is he not real? And those are and she slowly starts losing her mind as she's slowly drawn in as the film goes along. And it's a really fantastic psychological film. I highly recommend watching it. I really can't explain too much without delving into spoilers or anything like that. It is a really loosely plotted movie, so you have to be well aware of that going into it. I gave the film a 4 out of 5 stars. So next up, let's take a look at what I watched on the 28th of October. And this film is a horror film in the sense that it's part of the Italian giallo films of the 60s and 70s. If you're not familiar with the giallo films from Italy, certain names you'll probably remember are Dario Argento, Lucio Fulci, Mario Bava. Those are the chief directors of those films. And I watched The Cat O' Nine Tails, which was Dario Argento's second theatrical directed film. This film came out in 1971, and it revolves around the plot it's kind of a murder mystery, if you will, or it's a detective story. Basically, a reporter and a blind retired journalist try to solve a series of murders. The crimes are connected because they're part of experiments from a pharmaceutical company. The film stars Carl Malden in kind of a later role for him. The film is in English, although it is an Italian film. I tried to watch it with the Italian track as well as the English track, and it seemed like the English track was the correct way in which to watch the movie. It has an interesting style to it. The film is rather engrossing. There's a lot of twists and turns when it comes to a murder detective story like you've seen in a lot of other crime movies. It's not strictly horror. Like I said, it is dealing with murders that can be rather gruesome, but it toes that line. It is part of that giallo genre. That's why I counted it as one of the horror movies for me to watch for the month. If you're interested, I gave the film a 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's not the best Dario Argento film. For me, that is still Suspiria. Suspiria, I really, really like. I'm very curious to see what the remake by Luca Guadagnino is going to look like. I'm hearing very interesting things behind it. So next up, we have on the 29th of October, I watched a film by Mike Flanagan. Mike Flanagan is a director who's doing a lot of work now on Netflix when it comes to Stephen King adaptations, when it comes to the new Netflix series, A House on Haunting of Hill House, I believe it's called. And he is a really solid horror director. He is someone I think to watch out for. He's doing the kind of a pseudo sequel to The Shining in A Doctor's Sleep that's coming out, I believe, not next year, but the year after. And this film that I watched is called Before I Wake. Came out in 2016. You can watch it on Netflix. It's a very interesting film. It's yet again not a strict horror film. It's more of a serious, dramatic, psychological horror film. You know, it's a bunch of different genres in one. It stars Kate Bosworth, Jacob Tremblay, and Thomas Jane. Basically, the movie centers around the married couple of Kate Bosworth and Thomas Jane who have suffered a tragedy in their life. They've lost a child and they're looking to, for the lack of a better term, replace that child with an orphan child. But the orphan child, portrayed by Jacob Tremblay, has an interesting aspect to him where his nightmares or dreams tend to manifest themselves in reality. So, of course, that can lead to rather beautiful sequences of things like butterflies or fireflies or something gorgeous like that, or memories. But it also can lead to nightmarish type things that can be rather dangerous, rather violent. So, you know, it kind of goes both ways. So, the film is really dealing with this boy's, you know, traumatic past, his traumatic psychology, and just the relationship between Kate Bosworth, Thomas Jane, and him. It's more of a drama than it is a straight up horror film. There are, like I said, violent, horrific elements to it, but it is not strictly a horror film. It's also a film with a rather slow, deliberate pace where not a lot of things are happening to it. So you have to really be patient with the movie and really take it more as a drama than it is a horror movie. So I gave the film a 3.5 out of 5 stars. So as we're getting closer and closer to the eventual Halloween date, I watched another film on the 30th called Demonseed, which came out in 1977. And I have to tell you, people, this is one of the weirdest films I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of weird movies, and this film is just bananas. This film, like I said, came out in 1977. I'll just read you the synopsis here because I really can't explain it too well. A scientist creates Proteus, an organic supercomputer with artificial intelligence, which becomes obsessed with human beings, and in particular, the creator's wife. And just hearing that, it's gonna get weird because he becomes infatuated. This computer, this supercomputer, becomes infatuated with the idea of wanting to become human. And as you can tell by just that um, description and with the title of the movie, he's wanting to do it through rather unsavory ways. And the film doesn't really shy away from that, and the film can be rather graphic from that standpoint. It's not graphic from a modern sense or anything like that, but just the implications within the movie and the things that are hinted at or just, really just spelled out are really disturbing from a lot of different perspectives. The film is very sci-fi in its application of the relationship between technology and humanity. Julie Christie is in the movie. She is a famous actress from that era. She is, I thought, very good in the movie, considering she had to probably act opposite just a voice and things like that. It's a film that is really interesting, really weird. I had a few issues with it because some of the plot elements you just kind of have to go with and aren't really believable, as you could just tell by the way I described it to you. So I gave the film a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Yet again, it's not going to be a film for everyone. So we are finally arrived to the 31st of October or Halloween, and that night is a night that I reserve for really just doing a horror movie marathon. Typically, movies that are some of my favorites, movies that I've seen before, and right away, I started off with kind of a modern classic. It is a film that is now over 20 years old, and that is Scream, directed by Wes Craven. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this movie. It's becoming a huge classic and a huge film for many horror fans. If you're not familiar with the synopsis of the movie or with the plot of the movie, basically, a killer known as Clownface is on the loose. He is seemingly killing a bunch of young people within this town. And the movie starts off right away with a great, fantastic opening sequence, one of the best in any horror movie. This movie is done by the horror maestro, the late great Wes Craven. The film stars, of course, a cast that went on to be more prominent. It really got a lot of their notoriety from the Scream franchise. Nev Campbell, Courtney Cox was of course on Friends. David Arquette, Jamie Kennedy, Rose McGowan, Skeet Ulrich, Matthew Lillard, Drew Barrymore is in the movie. Liev Schreiber is slightly in the movie. Yeah, this is an all-time, favorite for many, and I always really enjoyed it. It is my favorite within the franchise. There are 4 Scream movies within the franchise. I think they fluctuate in quality. Yet again, it all depends on your particular interest in it. The next movie I watched was another one that is one of my personal favorites, and that is 28 Days Later, directed by Danny Boyle. Really, one of his first forays into true horror. You know what I mean? The film has a lot of dramatic and a lot of social commentary within it, but predominantly it is a horror movie. It is set in a post-apocalyptic world, kind of, where there's this killer virus that is this rage virus that has gotten out, and basically people become these kind of super zombies that are just running around uncontrollably, trying to bite people and trying to kill people, trying to feed on people. And once they bite you, or once you get any of their blood or any of their, human saliva or anything like that comes into contact with you or goes into your mouth or eyes or whatever, you end up turning pretty instantly. It's a very fast-paced, kinetic movie that really moves along. It's a short movie as well. The movie is actually 113 minutes. I kind of lied in that fact. But the film stars Cillian Murphy, Naomi Harris. I believe Brendan Gleeson makes an appearance within the movie as well. I really have always enjoyed this movie. This movie was also shot, I believe, on a digital handycam from 2002. It doesn't look fantastic, I'll tell you that. But it was very much the dawn of the digital age of movie making. People think digital movies or the digital filmmaking have been around for a long time, and it's really only been around essentially from the early 2000s. So this is a very interesting movie. I've always really liked its social commentary on things, and I really love Cillian Murphy as an actor. I think he's becoming more and more well known. He's shown up in a bunch of Christopher Nolan films. He has the BBC television series Peaky Blinders, which he is fantastic in. So definitely watch that movie if you haven't. Even if you're not a fan of zombie movies, these aren't the George Romero zombies from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. These are more modern zombies, if you will. Some people debate whether they're even can be categorized as zombies or not. I don't know. It's all It all depends on what you believe. Next up here is an all-time classic for me. It's one of my favorite things to watch every Halloween. It's not a feature film, it is a Halloween special, and that is It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. I'm absolutely a humongous, gigantic fan of everything Charlie Brown, Snoopy, Peanuts related. I've always had a soft spot in my heart ever since I was a little kid watching the specials like It's a Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, or the Charlie Brown and Snoopy show, or reading the comic strips that were in the newspaper or anything like that. I always love these specials and everything to do with with this material. It's the Great Pumpkin. Charlie Brown is a classic story. Basically, Linus, who is Charlie Brown's best friend, every year he decides to go wait in the pumpkin patch for the arrival of the Great Pumpkin, who is kind of this Santa Claus type creature that's supposed to bring you presents and all that stuff if you really truly believe in him. And every year he goes in there, and every year he's disappointed, but he always has that hope that he's going to do it. Charlie Brown and the rest of the Peanuts gang are going around and doing the usual Halloween stuff by trick or treating, going to a Halloween party. Snoopy's doing his own Red Baron type sequence, which is fantastic. I just absolutely love it. I give this a 5 out of 5 every time I watch it. I absolutely love it. So next up, and finally, the grand crescendo of it all, the grand finale, is of course Halloween. The John Carpenter Halloween from 1978. It is one of my favorite Halloween films of all time. It's one of my favorite horror movies of all time. It's a film I've watched several times. I've watched several of the sequels. I've seen all of the sequels plus the Rob Zombie reboot, plus the reboot we just got once again. I do have a review of that up on my channel right now. This film is a pure classic to me. It's a film that I think is really important for the horror genre. It's one of the staple classic slasher films. It's a film that I think is also rather important for just the overall history of film in general. There were films that were quite like this at the time, films that were made for as low a budget at the time that felt as gritty or as, really, real in the sense like Michael Myers goes into, small town America attacking just random people, and really just an unstoppable force within a place you think that it would be safe, your local neighborhood. And he is someone who is returning home to Haddonfield after about after I believe a 10-year absence of killing his sister, which you see in a great opening sequence that is shot almost entirely single camera shot, just steady cam shot that they were using at the time. You see a lot of POV shots from his perspective, which are fantastic. This is the feature length directorial. This is the feature length uh debut of acting for Jamie Lee Curtis, who of course everybody knows now. You have the veteran presence in Donald Pleasance, who of course reprised his role as Dr. Loomis in several of the Halloween sequels. This film I love so much. I love its atmosphere. I love the cinematography. The direction is fantastic. I love Jamie Lee Curtis in it. Just the way it depicts the accuracy of teenage life at the time is great, and just Michael Myers being the boogeyman, or being this shadow that creeps into your life and can just snuff you out at any moment. It's really fantastic. So I always give it a 5 out of 5 star. I always give it a 4.5. I always give it close to a 5 out of 5 stars. That's what I mean to say. I give it a 4.5 or a 5, depending on my mood. It is my favorite of the franchise. I really love it. I think it's better than any of the remakes that we've gotten recently. So check that movie out if you haven't already. And even if you aren't a horror fan, if horror movies aren't your thing, I think you can watch this movie and really appreciate it. It is a slower burn type movie. It's not a fast paced movie. It's a film that I don't think many modern horror film fans are going to really be into, because it is slower paced. It's not the jump scares that you're used to seeing. It's more deliberate. And the film actually doesn't run that long, yet it has a slower pace. The movie only clocks in at 91 minutes. So, this has been my final recap of all of the horror films that I watched in the month of October. If you like this video, please check out the other videos on my channel. I'm going to continue right along with doing the things I typically do with movie reviews, Blu-ray reviews, and the haul videos that I do every single month. So please stick around for all of those. So please stick around for all of those. If you so please stick around for all of those, and thank you for watching all of these videos.